We finally need to have a proper conversation about Link21, the dream of strengthening rail connections between San Francisco, Oakland, and beyond. If one Transbay Tube was so great, why can't we have another? Well, we can, but it seems like we have to do it in the most roundabout way possible. Ever since I started to get into urbanism discussions in the Bay Area, this project has been a fixation for many. There's been a constant back and forth about what it should look like. Should it be BART gauge or should it be standard gauge? The trillion-dollar question about which everyone seems to be convinced of their answer, as if one of those choices is strictly better than the other. Team BART and Team Mainline battling it out for supremacy over a few new miles of track. All sorts of crayons drawn, imagining what new trips could be possible with this project if the horse that you back is to win the race. And the other horse sucks, right? And for a long time, I was in that camp. I had my preference and was willing to die on the hill. Ever since I started the channel, I wanted to cover this topic in some form. I'd imagined making a video where I defended my choice with an unfiltered passion. But now, looking back a couple years later, I'm glad I didn't. To say that my opinions have changed a lot would be an understatement almost as big as the cost of this project. It's not necessarily that my opinion has changed on which option I prefer. Frankly, that's now irrelevant. What has changed is a general frustration on how everything was executed, all the discourse around it, and what it says about how to properly do a mega project. So strap in. So let's start at the very beginning. San Francisco and Oakland never really had the best railway connections between them, largely thanks to a certain little body of water. Rail crossings would not come until 1939, with ferries being the only option up to that point. Southern Pacific and the much-loved Key system operated services across the Bay Bridge until it all brutally came to an end in 1958. A very short lifespan, especially in transit terms. But something was cooking in the background. A new rapid transit project befitting of the Great Society's era. Something faster, something much higher capacity. Instead of going over it, you'd now go under it. It had been talked about for decades prior, but now it was happening. A Transbay Tube. September 1974 marked the beginning of the Transbay Tube. In just 10 minutes, you could now get from downtown Oakland to downtown San Francisco, hassle-free and at great speed. No, not that kind of great speed. Sometimes this engineering feat gets taken for granted, and it's a testament to how far ahead of its time it was. This would be proven in 1989, when Loma Prieta forced the Bay Bridge to close for a month. How long did it take BART to get the Transbay Tube back to service? Less than 12 hours after the earthquake first hit. Operations worked tirelessly to run trains 24 hours a day for 6 weeks while bridge repairs were ongoing. In the wake of tragedy, this recovery was something worth celebrating, and in fact it came to be known as BART's finest hour. The Transbay Tube in its peak can run 24 trains per hour in each direction. That's one every 2.5 minutes. BART trains can be up to 10 cars long, so in theory, around 60,000 people could pass through the tube in both directions in just 1 hour. That's nowhere near the actual figure today, or ever, but it's a thought worth imagining. It's a world-class piece of transit infrastructure, but it has a major problem. Due to the track gauge and height, it can only support BART trains. This was a conscious decision to ensure the system runs at a very high frequency, but it restricts the expansion of other rail services. The dream was a new 4-track megatunnel, 2 tracks for BART and 2 for basically anything else that uses standard gauge. Sadly, the dream would be stopped in its tracks by a certain little pandemic that likely permanently altered ridership habits in the region, so the 4 tracks would become just 2. And so, the battlefield was set.
Hey you, which Transbay Tube do you want? Standard gauge or BART gauge? For standard gauge, please press 1. For BART gauge, please press 2. For dual gauge, please hang up. Thank you for your choice. There are currently 3,982 pages of environmental impact studies ahead of you in the queue. Your estimated wait time is 46 years. Make sure to stay on the line or you could lose your place. This call will be recorded for quality and training purposes, and it may also be summarized by artificial intelligence. No, we're not asking you for consent. Have a good day.
So if you were to ask me right now, what is my opinion on Link21? Should it be standard gauge or should it be broad gauge? Well, I'll tell you, the best option for Link21 is, drumroll please, to have not entertained the idea of an option at all. Now look, there's nothing wrong with proposing multiple ideas for a transit project and asking for public input. It happened in LA when the metro was deciding how to connect the CNK lines, but this isn't that. This is a very broad and abstract distinction. While Link21 did present 6 different scenarios, very little detail was provided beyond the tube itself's alignment and where the new stations could be. It's all rather fuzzy. Nothing about service levels and who would operate them. It almost feels like presenting the 2 options invariably places all the attention on the tube itself, and I think that, on its own, is what causes a divide and general sense of unfairness. Because yeah, if you take the tube in isolation, obviously it makes far more sense to choose BART gauge. Because being a rapid transit system, you'll necessarily send more trains through it. Why build such a fancy, expensive piece of infrastructure to run fewer trains? But just focusing on the tube is fruitless for everyone. Link21 isn't just about the tube. It was never just about the tube. It was about encouraging modal shift across the entire Northern California mega region. It will change policy, upgrade legacy infrastructure, and maybe, just maybe, finally lead to putting up the wires. And when you phrase it like that, the standard gauge option wins by far. It's a lot harder to deliver that messaging though. If you proudly declare that you're building a new flashy standard gauge Transbay Tube, there would inevitably be lots of backlash. Everyone would cry, but what about BART, until the cows come home. It could well be the case that the BART option resonated with more people because it's quite a bit easier to imagine what that would look like. We have many BART subways already, and most of them are pretty good all things considered. You can't really deviate from that. You will have frequent electrified rapid transit with large stations at decently spaced intervals. You will unlock new destinations in San Francisco, potentially a Geary subway. The only thing that you could change is building stations to a shorter length than 10 cars, but it doesn't seem like something that BART would want to happen. For all the fact that Silicon Valley extension gets, most of us already have a mental model of what the service will look like. And of course, it would be remiss of me not to mention that VTA are actively exploring ways to cut costs and redesign the stations, and maybe even change the tunnel boring method. Remember how I just said that it's easier to imagine what a Link21 BART line could look like? Well, that's not exactly true either. Just because the baseline of what BART could be is clearer, and probably better than the baseline for mainline rail, doesn't mean that there aren't important factors to consider. If you make a new subway in San Francisco, where would it go? If you make a new subway in Oakland, where would it go? How do you place the stations to best ensure that they effectively serve neighborhoods and don't cause disruption? How do you place the exits to take full advantage of a BART station's length? If the main objective is de-interlining BART, then how do you ensure that it's done correctly? What would the service patterns look like? Which ones would remain in the first tube, and which ones would move to the new tube? Do you want more than just the existing 5 lines? Do you need a second Oakland Y? Or another complex flying junction? What other parts of BART would need upgrading as well, such as maybe quad-tracking the stretch from Lake Merritt to Bayfair? What would TOD look like? How do we minimize park and ride facilities? These are all important questions, and if Link21 had chosen BART, then we would need to have those discussions. Some of those points are applicable to the mainline rail option as well, but you get the idea. And I'm going to answer all those questions with another question. Is de-interlining really worth it? Well, let's do the math. The current Transbay Tube can handle 24 trains per hour, or in theory, 240 cars in total. Currently at off-peak times, they're running 6 8-car trains and 9 6-car trains an hour. A few 6-car trains get lengthened to 8 at peak times, so let's say on average every train is 7 cars long. And there's 15 of them, so multiply that out and we get that the Transbay Tube is currently running about 44% of maximum capacity. But that's only scratching the surface. BART is working on CBTC signaling that would take the tube's capacity to 30 trains per hour, or 300 cars. When you consider that, current service levels are only 35% of what they could be. Demand through the tube would therefore have to increase around 3x to even warrant any serious conversation about de-interlining. And it's not just a new tube. You need to ensure that the services you want to cut off from the current network are completely cut off. Again, that would mean quad tracking. That would mean new flyovers. It's a very complex task, all for what, just a few extra Transbay BART trains, while also lowering service in some of the existing core sections? I've never really been one to argue that BART urgently needs to be de-interlined. I mean, even its sister metro system in DC is getting on much better following the return of automation this year. You'll recall a couple years ago that they had a whole study about how to de-interline the blue, orange, and silver lines. They presented several options and invited the public to voice their opinion. They said they'd choose an option by the end of 2023, and still nothing has come. And I have a guess as to why. As much as budget is a concern, they must have figured that restoring ATO would provide a more immediate and tangible service improvement. And they were right. In fact, thanks to ATO, they're able to run trains faster and even shove in a couple additional Silver Line services during peak hours. The DC Metro absolutely needed that though. I haven't been back there since ATO returned, when the couple times I did go, headways were an absolute mess. And that was not because of interlining, it was slower speeds and inflated dwell times. Those doors took forever to open. BART doesn't quite have that problem, and in general, BART trains are pretty good at making up delays. In fact, they can run 10 miles an hour faster in some parts if they need to, especially the Transbay Tube. In a way, the tube is like a launch pad of sorts, an uninterrupted underground straightaway where trains can reach their maximum speed. And maximum loudness, but that's a topic for another time. Frankly, the whole idea that a delay in Concord will screw up service in Fremont just doesn't have an awful lot of truth to it. The fact that BART only has 50 stations kind of abstracts away just how far it actually travels, and how fundamentally quick it is. My point with all this is simple. BART being interlined is not chiefly what holds back their current service levels. It's budget. That won't change with a new tube alone. So now let's talk standard gauge, or mainline rail if you will. This seems like the option that Link21 wanted all along. I mean, after all, it's in their name. There are 21 counties to be linked. Get it? Anyway, going with this option would mean, of course, a standard gauge Transbay Tube tall enough to fit double-decker trains and catenary that extends from Salesforce Transit Center in San Francisco to Alameda, then reconnects with existing main lines. This would enable all the regional rail services that we currently know and love, which don't interact north of San Jose, to finally have direct connectivity with each other in San Francisco and Oakland. You could get all sorts of creative service patterns. For example, having Caltrain and Capital Corridor exchange sides of the bay. Ever wanted a one-seat ride from Palo Alto to Richmond? From Davis to Mowbray? The possibilities are endless. But it's that term, one-seat ride, that I think gets planners and politicians a little bit overly excited. And it's a valid point, but sometimes it's hard to tell what is meant. A one-seat ride from door to door? Does taking local urban rail still allow it to count as a one-seat train ride? Because in reality, say, running Capital Corridor to San Francisco is really only running it to the financial district, Soma, and Mission Bay. Which is fine. It's not the job of regional rail to handle the first and last few miles. However, I think the constant focus on minimizing transfers can lead us to unusual service patterns. Changing trains is going to be part of a journey, no matter where in the world you are. We may as well make those key nodes more pleasant places to do so. And believe it or not, the Link21 plans do call for that. As I've talked about in a previous video, a new mainline station could be built at either the West Oakland or 12th Street BART station, which would provide another opportunity to connect between different services. Jack London will get rebuilt, I imagine Coliseum will too, and Richmond and Millbrae will continue their current role as major transfer hubs with expansions of their own, in the latter's case to support California high-speed rail. On paper, the allure seems very compelling. On the peninsula side, you have Caltrain and California high-speed rail, and on the East Bay side, you have Amtrak services. They don't physically connect, thanks to a massive body of water between them, so the rational thing to do is to tie them up somehow. The thought of the BART option was that a new BART alignment could hit Jack London and Salesforce more directly, allowing you to get between the two sets of services very quickly. It makes sense, just look at the Elizabeth line, which connects to quite a few major mainline rail stations in London, like Paddington, Liverpool Street, and Stratford. But if you're able to, then why not just bring all the services to each other? London's termini never connected because historically they weren't allowed to. That's a huge part of why Thameslink is so overcrowded and prone to delays. It is the only mainline railway that crosses central London in a north to south direction. On that note, let me know if you'd like to see a video about Thameslink in the near future. Back in the Bay, there's no rule saying that Caltrain and Amtrak can't share tracks. I mean, they literally do in San Jose for one. Well, aside from freight ownership, but let's pretend for now that doesn't exist. Just because Caltrain has spent all of its existence as a regional railway between San Francisco and San Jose, doesn't mean it can't go to Oakland and further north as well. And the same is true on the opposite side. I'm sure Amtrak would love to say that they finally go to San Francisco. Unless you wanted to build a 20-track Waterloo-style terminal on Treasure Island, these services will have to run together, so deal with it. Now, on the other side of the same coin, there's the argument that, oh, just call everything BART. Just call everything Caltrain. Just paint the kisses blue like BART. Just merge all the agencies. That's not really the right way to think of things either. There's nothing fundamentally wrong about having multiple rail operators, provided they have things like integrated fares, schedules, maps, transfer stations, and maybe even route numbering schemes. Here, I'll give you an example. Remember how Not Just Bikes went on and on about how he traveled the world in his 20s and became a massive urbanist because of that, only to discard all of his travel and become a Dutch tourism advert? Well, I'm actually going to use the knowledge I gained when I traveled in my 20s, unlike some people. Anyway, I wanted to share an example from one trip that I recently had. Barcelona has a lot of rail operators all of its own. The Metro has one, the regional rail has another. The third thing that's kind of half Metro, half regional rail that's kind of similar to BART in a lot of ways is yet another operator, and even the trams are operated by a fourth company. That's a lot, right? Well, it's all fare integrated, and the line naming system is uniform across the board. A Metro line is L, a suburban line is S, a regional line is R, a regional express line is R with 2 digits, and the trams are T. Their high-quality signage and wayfinding also helps, and as a visitor who spent a week there, I rarely had issues finding my trains. And I rode a lot of trains. So yeah, if anything, it's the buses in the bay that need consolidation way more than the rails. There are lots of different kinds of rail operations after all. The Amtrak stuff like Capital Corridor is focused on intercity travel, which usually means fewer stops, fancier seats, longer average trips, and even a cafe car. Caltrain, meanwhile, is a bona fide regional line, and BART is somewhere between that and a Metro. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not one to obsess over transit terminology, but the type of service that you run does inform decisions like rolling stock, passenger amenities, and station design. As a simple example, you'd likely opt for front and back seating on an intercity train that people will spend a couple hours on, whereas something more urban should optimize for standing room, which usually means lots of sideways seats. One of the challenges that you'll likely face with the new tube is how to best balance services on all the different main lines. It's effectively building a regional rail system from the ground up, though with the added advantage of already having BART serving some more central places. On the San Francisco side, it's pretty easy since the tube is just being attached to Salesforce, but even there's some fun stuff that you can do. You could branch the approach tracks from the tube to allow trains to terminate at Salesforce in both directions. There may only be 6 tracks, but the platforms will be long enough to potentially allow double berthing. By the way, that's when 2 trains use the same platform, which currently happens at LA Union Station, for example. The only issue is that high-speed rail may have their own fare gates and thus have platforms reserved for their operations. In that case, it's far more likely that you only have 2 regional rail tracks, should ideally have trains flying through them continuing into the tube every few minutes. On the Oakland side, you'd likely need a Y similar to the one on BART, except a little simpler since you probably wouldn't need flyovers since the frequency won't be that high, though it would certainly be nice. This is because you'd ideally want to send trains both towards Richmond and Sacramento and down to Jack London and Coliseum. It's just 2 stops, but East Oakland does deserve better rail service. After all, the Coliseum area itself is planned to be redeveloped, even though the A's no longer call that stadium home. Shame on you, John Fisher. So now the $1 trillion question. What would the services actually be? I'll split this into different categories, one for each potential operator. Caltrain is probably the easiest service to imagine, since it's a pretty natural extension of what we already have. Once it gets to Salesforce, simply send it across the new tube and run it onto the existing rail lines. Of course, those lines would have to be electrified and more heavily grade separated, but let's be optimistic and say that happens. You could have most of the trains go north towards Richmond, with a few others going south to Jack London and Coliseum. In Caltrain's long-term vision, they plan to run up to 8 trains an hour, and even if only half of them cross the tube, it'll still be a very solid level of service. Though the more I dwell on it, I think they all should. This would have the obvious benefit of speeding up trips from the peninsula to Oakland and Berkeley. While you may still need BART for your final destination, The change from Caltrain to BART can now happen on the East Bay side, at that West Oakland or 12th Street station. However, there's one thing that's missing. If you want to run frequent service on the line up to Richmond, then they really could do with some more stops. For example, I would love an infill station near the UC Village, maybe one more in the Richmond Annex. The existing Berkeley Amtrak station may get comparably little service now, but it's not a completely dead area. In fact, the opposite, it's very close to a major shopping street. Speaking of Amtrak California stations, that network could also expand with a new tube. For one, I'm sure it would be really appealing to say that the California Zephyr finally goes to San Francisco, something that was advertised since the Southern Pacific years, but of course never actually happened. I'm not sure if Salesforce has provisions for an Amtrak lounge, but it would be nice for premium travelers, or just those who want to make up
poor bid.
At just one train a day, but it could well spend hours hanging around. I wouldn't send it down the tube. The Coast Starlight will also definitely not deviate to San Francisco, so what about the more regular services? Capital Corridor crossing the tube feels good, but it really comes down to what the service wants to be. I'd love a world where they run half-hourly departures from Sacramento, which would alternate between going to Diridon as they do now, and crossing the tube to end at Millbrae via Salesforce. It's also possible that they stick to one pattern and max it out, which would more likely mean staying in the East Bay. After all, they're working on moving to the Coast Subdivision, so it's not like those southern rights-of-way that parallel BART are entirely neglected. It's sometimes said that California high-speed rail should extend through the tube, but I think a faster, more frequent, and dual-mode CAPI would be good enough, perhaps based on the aero technology used on the Northeast Regional. After all, if you're taking high-speed rail from the Central Valley to Sacramento, you'd likely just take the eastern branch and avoid the bay entirely. Meanwhile, I imagine the San Joaquins will not use the tube, but it won't be hard to fit it in, since it probably won't be more frequent than hourly, and even that's a push. Those at the furthest south parts of the line would likely offer high-speed rail to San Francisco. Only potential issue is demand from Stockton itself to San Francisco, which would require a change to another service in Richmond or Oakland just like it is today. And that's it? Only like 6 to 8 trains through the tube an hour at most? Yeah, that doesn't feel too great. And for a while, that was my one concern with this idea. Why spend a fortune on a new tube that doesn't get utilized to its full capacity? But, you could just make new services. The idea of creating additional rail services isn't exactly that out there. It's already spelled out in Link21's plans. This graph in the planning document calls for urban vertical line metro service to run all across the main lines, in slightly shorter versions of the existing Caltrain and Capital Corridor networks plus the new tube. These urban vertical line metro services are expected to be fairly frequent and would allow Caltrain to focus more on good service in the peninsula. Interestingly, the plan does also call Caltrain an urban vertical line metro service, which at the level of frequency they want to run makes total sense. Remember, the whole point of Link21 is not to stick with what we already have, but to totally reimagine rail service in the region. Sounds like corporate fluff, but it's true. There are plenty of places where there are existing rail connections but more frequent service is justified, like much of the Capital Corridor route within the Bay Area itself. However, that high frequency may not best be served by intercity vertical line express trains. The only question is, who would this new auxiliary network be operated by? Would it be Caltrain, BART, or someone new? Personally, I hope it's not the latter, as if we need yet another agency, but for now I'm calling it the Pulse Network. It has 3 services, each ideally running at a frequency of up to every 15 minutes, and I'm assigning them numbers to contrast with the letters used on current BART. The rolling stock would be the latest in regional trains, which now is something like the Statler Flirt, but may well be something different in like 2067 when all this is done, if they're even still building trains by then. Pulse 1 starts at Coliseum and ends at Millbrae, a trip that on today's BART network is not a one-seat ride. It would give South and East Oakland slightly quicker access to San Francisco Airport, as well as boosting local service on the current Caltrain line's densest area. Overall, getting from Coliseum to SFO using this service will be about 10 to 15 minutes faster than present day. Meanwhile, Pulse 2 would be an intra-East Bay line. It might carry on its starts up north in Martinez, which would finally mean that the North Concord BART station can have Martinez removed from its name. It then stops at the already under construction Hercules station, perhaps a new one in North Richmond, then continues at all mentioned stops from Richmond on. Past Coliseum, I like the idea of a Hayward stop near Mount Eden, which would hopefully connect to a revived San Mateo Bridge bus service. And finally, this line is kind of on its own, but I like the thought of a Pulse 3 between Great America and Blossom Hill via Diridon, which would act as sort of an express service of the VTA light rail. Pulse 2 and 3 use trackage that isn't expected to be electrified under the latest state rail plan, so I'd hope that either gets sorted out, or they have to use DMUs initially. Or maybe California's new favorite technology, hydrogen trains? I mean, look, it's zero emissions. You can't complain about that, right? It's often said that BART is similar to a European S train, though honestly, this network of new short mainline services is even closer to a European S train. Most of those spend time using mainline railways and are quite closely integrated with longer distance services. Something like this isn't intended to replace or even compete with current BART, just to provide another option for quick urban travel in a very polycentric region. There are cases where current BART will still be faster for your trip, there are cases where this Pulse network will be faster, and there will even be some that require multiple types of trains. The point is to allow flexibility and redundancy, while bringing frequent service to all sorts of destinations without having to rely solely on longer distance trains that may be in limited supply. On the user experience side, the Pulse network would have the same payment system as regional trains that already use Clipper. You would tap in and out at the stations with Clipper readers on the platforms, and the system won't know which train operator you took, but the point is that it wouldn't need to. If you're taking a trip within the urban region, you should be able to just show up and get the next train that stops at your desired station. Ideally, the only thing you need to consider is whether your train is local or express, which is easy to communicate with good digital wayfinding. As an example, this bit of the East London line carries both overground and southern trains that stop at some of the same stations. There is just one set of fare gates to access all the platforms. When I tap my Oyster card, it doesn't account for whether I took one or the other. This is what I mean when I say that it's fine to have multiple operators, so long as the signage and fare integration is consistent. The creation of the Pulse network may even allow current BART to become even more local. Right now, travel time between San Jose and San Francisco is pretty comparable on Caltrain and BART. In fact, at off-peak times, BART wins. However, if Caltrain does act on their plans to run express trains off-peak, then that will be faster, and most of the traffic between San Jose and San Francisco would be redirected to Caltrain. That might end up having BART be seen as the more local option, especially once the Irvington stop opens, and if the advocates pushing for a San Antonio stop finally get their wish. Okay, this is the part of the video where it gets completely off script and tangents are very likely. If you're still watching to this point, then you are just an absolute nerd and I appreciate you for that. But yeah, all of this Link21 discourse, it sort of makes me think, what is the fundamental nature of our different transit modes in the Bay Area? Like, BART and Caltrain want to be very similar, but it still feels like there is something inherently different about both of them. And that might have to do with how they were designed. Like, Caltrain inherited a right-of-way that went through a lot of historic downtowns, and Caltrain itself goes down a sort of one-dimensional corridor in the peninsula. Obviously, there are places that are sort of perpendicular to it, like East Palo Alto, for example, and lots of other job centers off of 101 that, you know, you've seen people arguing that a second BART line should be paralleling the Caltrain line, but in reality, I think the best way to serve that would be to improve the buses in the Soundtrans area. Whereas BART was a sort of new build system that didn't use that many historic right-of-ways. They did use some from the key system, but obviously grade separated. But it was specifically a post-suburb, post-automobile creation. The stations were placed in suburban areas that were deemed to have high ridership potential into downtowns. San Francisco and Oakland, namely Berkeley to an extent, and San Jose once the Silicon Valley Phase 2 extension opens. But until those connections are built, you can see, for example, the Warm Springs, Milpitas, and Berryessa stations consistently have terrible ridership right now, because you'd imagine most of the people that live in those areas are going to be commuting to San Jose, not Oakland or San Francisco or somewhere else. So yeah, once SB2 opens, those stations will get a boost. Like Dublin Pleasanton, for example, that station's been a roaring success since it was added to the BART network. You look at TOD, you look at it being a bus hub,
but it was placed in a strategic location on the border of the two cities that is close to a highway, 680 namely, that has a lot of bus potential from San Ramon and the like. But yeah, it was more like BART was placed in the suburbs that can have the most value of commuting into mainly San Francisco, to a lesser extent Oakland. And that's why in the downtowns that it goes to, it runs right in the sort of major employment centers. Like the San Francisco BART subway was always going to be Market Street. Like the primary subway that was going to get would always be Market Street, even though they had plans for Geary and whatever. The Market Street subway is a corridor of regional significance because this is where the major employment centers and sort of major muni transit hubs are. Like if BART's first subway was Geary, it wouldn't have not really been that useful. And you look at the sort of calls for a Geary subway, for it to be BART would be obviously amazing, but is it the best modal choice for something that is more of local significance? Like, most people who are coming into San Francisco are probably not going to be using the Geary corridor. Not to say that wouldn't happen, there are lots of useful destinations there that will pull riders from across the region, but ultimately I think because it is a more local heavy corridor, light metro, or just a metro that is smaller than BART, both in terms of car width and train length, that would make a lot more sense. Same goes for Stevens Creek. You know, a lot of people have called for the Silicon Valley BART extension to, instead of going to Santa Clara from Diridon, turn left and go under Stevens Creek, which is a corridor that is underserved by rail transit, or completely unserved rather, but has a lot of potential and its buses pull in plenty of riders. However, similarly to Geary, most of the people who are coming into San Jose aren't going to be going down Stevens Creek. It's a sort of local corridor. It is more of a local heavy corridor, so elevated light rail, which is what VTA wants to do and I think would be amazing, does make a lot more sense there. So when you put all that together, it feels like new build BART lines would have to have that regional significance, like the Silicon Valley extension that's going right into downtown San Jose and Diridon Station, which are two very important points in the city that have regional potential. So what about Caltrain? You know, it is a very efficient line right now that shuttles between two centers of mass, but all the way scattered in between are cities in their own right that do get ridership to and from them, which aren't necessarily bound to the two bigger cities on each end of the main electrified line. So why extend Caltrain if it's so efficient? Well, with Caltrain it's a lot easier to expand it because there are already standard gauge railways in the East Bay that could do with more frequent service. Like the current situation now with places like Martinez, it's pretty dire, but that's a place that could do with a lot more service because the North Concord Martinez BART station has more frequent service, but it is so far from actual Martinez. So in that sense, there is more of an immediate gain to improve the regional rail in that area to boost the service of underserved stations with railways that already exist that just need some electrification, grade separation, double tracking in some places, and negotiating with the freight companies. That won't be quick, cheap, or easy, but it's a lot more practical, I think. And it would be really transformative. Like, when you compare the two Link21 options, it's sort of marginal BART improvements versus, and I don't use this word lightly, generational regional rail improvements. And it would also sort of allow the two systems, BART and regional rail, which could be Caltrain plus the sort of pulse network / shorter versions of Caltrain or whatever they're going to be called or whoever's going to operate them, it would allow them to be seen as part of the coherent transit system. Like if you ask a Parisian, are the Metro and RER the same thing? They'd say no, but they are so tightly knit with each other that it does in some senses feel like part of the same system, so to speak. Though the RER is not the actual Ile-de-France suburban rail, that would be Transilien. But even then, there's a lot of places where the RER and Transilien share tracks, and if not that, then at least have common stations. So in that sense, it can still be viewed as part of the same system. Whereas with BART and Caltrain, they largely exist right now as two very disjoint systems, with only one connection point in Millbrae, and another way to get between them to go via San Francisco, which takes a long time, and eventually another connection in Diridon, but still, BART and Caltrain are largely viewed as different systems. So the best way to change that is to bring the two services closer to each other in the north, sort of north of San Jose. That could be done with a new BART subway that links up like Jack London and Salesforce, but it could also do with bringing the regional rail closer to BART stations on the north side, like more service to Richmond, a regional rail station in West Oakland or 12th Street that's right at the BART station, improving Coliseum. Like, Coliseum is not really thought of as a mainline connection to BART because it only gets one type of service and the walk between the stations is very annoying. So how do you best fix that? By improving the service on the weaker option, which right now is by far the mainline. I think another interesting example is Chicago. Like, I know you Chicagoans are out there. There's a lot of you. But I'm sure a lot of people from Chicago view the L and Metra as separate systems. And, you know, even the sets of Metro lines that terminate at different stations in Chicago are viewed as different systems because they don't connect to each other. There are no termini in Chicago that are directly connected to an L station. You do have to walk a little bit. So if Chicago had a Link21 moment, that would probably be extending Metro Electric a bit north and connecting it to the UP North line, which itself is a really good line, and then electrifying up to like Evanston or something. Then you would have a really solid regional rail line that would probably be as good as Caltrain and could have very frequent service and be an express alternative to the CTA Red Line, for example. That would be Chicago's Link21 moment, and I think that would be really nice, and it would go some way to sort of reducing the gap between the L and Metro. So that's what the Bay needs. BART and Caltrain do look different. One uses double-deck trains, one uses more subway-like trains, but they both serve very similar purposes, even though they were built in different eras, and as such, have their stations in different types of locations. But again, they are viewed as two different systems because of their weak connections. And I think if you wanted to connect them, it is more valuable to bring the Caltrain network onto our lesser used standard gauge alignments versus one BART subway that just links Jack London to San Francisco. That's effectively all you're doing. Why not have connections in further north places like Richmond? Like, that could be a convenient stopping point for the San Joaquins to get you onto services now, which is what happens already, but you could get onto even more services. You can have again, just a 2-seat ride from Stockton to somewhere on the peninsula, which right now is 3 or 4 different services. That is the whole point, and that is why Link21 are so obsessed with this mega region idea. The word sounds really silly, I'm not going to deny that. But if you want to have that sort of view that makes the region more connected, then regional rail is the better option for the Transbay Tube. That is an undisputed fact. And it is the option that they should have gone with from the beginning and just really communicated why it is a good option. That is something that Link21 has failed to do effectively. It just presented different scenarios and left the public to sort of come to their own conclusions. And that is why the schism exists in these transit spaces, that you see people very passionate about one of their choices. Again, if Link21 had chosen BART and built it, I would have been ecstatic because, you know, it would be so cool to imagine a new BART line down Erie. But ultimately, what aligns with their vision, and when you think about it a little bit deeper, what will bring the most improvement to rail service I'm going to say it again, the mega region, is a regional rail Transbay Tube and extending the Caltrain and potentially Amtrak California networks. Oof, that was longer than I thought, but there we go. That is the Link21 video. It's coming up to 40 minutes now, I think. Absolutely insane, but I've been wanting to make this for quite a while, and thank you for those of you that are still here. It means a lot, and this isn't my final Bay Area video. There's going to be a few more whenever I get the idea to talk about something, but this is sort of my last major chapter in covering Bay Area transit. I think I've talked about pretty much everything in the region now. But again, there will always be more to talk about, I'm sure, as things develop over time. So yeah, thank you so much.